23 years of the Cyber Week. Takeaways for mediators. This is our topic for today, a part of the series Communication Skills with Daniel Rainey.
Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent.
Hello, my name is Natalia Łowska-Czajka. I am an advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
And hi, this is Mac Pierre-Louis, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout Florida and Texas.
And I'm Daniel Rainey. I'm just outside of Washington, D.C., and work with Holistic Solutions Incorporated.
It is our pleasure to have a permanent contributor on this podcast, Daniel Rainey, with an absolutely fantastic hot topic, because it is just the time when the 23rd Cyber Week, an event that happens entirely online, but sets up the trends for the online dispute resolutions, and also gives a lot of insight into how any legal and mediation practice can develop for the future, is really concentrated. And it will be our pleasure to interview Dan today about what happened during the Cyber Week, especially as Dan was one of the speakers during this event, as well as a member of the organizing committee. Dan, it will be our pleasure to hear what do you think the main takeaways from this event can be.
Okay, thank you, Natalia and Mac. I appreciate the invitation to be with you again. This is the 23rd year of Cyber Week, as you said, and it goes back to a time when not very many people were really interested in what we were talking about in terms of online dispute resolution. But as I've said many times, COVID was the big bang for ODR. So for the last year and a half, everybody's been talking about online dispute resolution. This year, Cyber Week, in its 23rd year, looks back a little bit. Pardon me. It's organized this year around the chapters in a recently published book, Online Dispute Resolution Theory and Practice. And so the primary webinars that anchored every day of Cyber Week this time around were populated by the authors of those chapters. And there are two, before we get into our discussion, there are two links that you'll find associated with this podcast. One link is for the book, Online Dispute Resolution Theory and Practice, with a 40% discount coupon for people listening to this podcast. And the other is a link to odr.info, where you can find the agenda for Cyber Week and a link on the agenda to videos of all of the webinars and presentations that occurred during the week. So having said that, I think there are 3 or 4 areas that I could say are different and maybe notable about what we did during Cyber Week this time around. The first one is sort of general and has to do with system design. When the first book was published, the first edition of ODR Theory and Practice was published in 2012, we were talking about lessons we thought we should keep in mind that grew out of dispute resolution design that we might apply to designing ODR systems. This time we were talking about lessons we have learned from designing ODR systems. And some of those lessons have to do with how one builds in ethical parameters and how one does sort of people-centered design. And so that was a very interesting discussion we had about how far we've come and the fact that we now have a little bit of insight because of experience with how to design these systems, particularly ones that are associated with the courts and with access to justice. A second area that I would sort of focus on is that this time around we had speakers from around the world, as I put it, from every continent except Antarctica. And the topics that they were talking about were essentially very simply what's going on in your part of the world with online dispute resolution. If we asked that question 23 years ago, the answer would have been not much in most of the world. If we had asked that question 5 years ago, the answer would have been maybe a little bit in most of the world. This year, everybody's able to talk about ongoing projects and things that are moving forward in online dispute resolution. So there are activities and there are things being developed pretty much everywhere. That's a big difference this time around. The other thing that we talked about a little bit differently is ethics. In years past, we've been talking about how we should be thinking differently about the notion of ethics, particularly mediator ethics and third-party ethics as they are affected by the use of technology. Well, once again, this time we have a lot more experience talking about this, and in fact, we can point to the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, the International Mediation Institute, and the American Bar Association's Task Force on ODR Ethics as just examples of organizations that are trying to codify the differences in practice and where we should be headed in terms of practice for online dispute resolution. And again, that's an advancement over where we've been in the past. And finally, the other thing that I would highlight that's different this time around is that we had a lot more talk about the human side of online dispute resolution. We, in fact, Noam Ebner, who was one of the speakers, and I wrote an article about how you maintain empathy, how you deal with communication issues in an online environment in a way that takes advantage of the things that you gain by using technology and helps you compensate for the things that you lose when you take one of the online channels as your primary channel for communication. And sort of closely tied to the ethics is the notion of culture and adaptation of mediation styles and adaptation of technology into the expectations that are sort of inherent in different cultural and legal approaches to mediation particularly. You know, back in 2019, the Singapore Convention rather on mediation was rolled out in Singapore. And as part of that effort, the notion was that we're beginning to do more and more cross-border international mediation. And there was no sort of guiding light, so to speak, on what that means for mediation cross borders using technology. So the Singapore Convention attempts to address that. And I guess the point that we made during CYBERWEEK that I think is an important one to remember is that you don't have to go across borders to have an intercultural third-party experience. Most of us live in countries that are now multicultural. And that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But what it means to me as a third party is that I'm probably never again going to sit down in a mediation or an arbitration or a facilitation and have a truly unicultural experience. Even if the people who look like me and come from a similar background from me are sitting around the table, there's a very good chance that culturally we don't share some things. And so one of the things that it highlighted for us, and this sort of runs as a theme all the way from the people-centered design all the way through everything else, is that it's probably more important than ever as we integrate technology into our work as third parties to engage in a true conversation with the parties that we're dealing with to make sure that the expectations that the parties have about our behavior and the process match the expectations of the third party who's delivering the service. And it should be a dialogue. It shouldn't be a monologue, and it shouldn't be a simple presentation. It should be a discussion with the parties about what makes them feel safe, what makes them feel valued, what makes them feel that there's a structure that they can count on. And so you put all that together, and I'd say that the big difference between CYBERWEEK this time around and CYBERWEEK in years past is that in the years past, we were speculating about what was going to happen. We were speculating about how we would adapt. And this time we were looking back and saying, okay, we've come this far. This is how we've adapted. This is what we've done. And being a little bit critical of ourselves about some of those adaptations and looking to see whether we can do them better. And so, if you're looking for sort of a thumbnail on this year's CYBERWEEK, that would be it for me, is that we now have enough information to be self-critical, to do a, what would really be called a reflective practice. And that's kind of where we were this time around. And if you guys have any questions about, specifically what was in there or any of the things I've touched on, I'm more than happy to sort of go into them. But that was my high level sort of summary of where we were for the week. And again, by the way, you can look at the in-depth conversations by going to the URL for the CyberWeek agenda and clicking on the links for the videos.
Yes, and we'll definitely place those few links on the bottom of the YouTube description. So if you're listening to this on audio, make sure you head over to the lawyersandmediators.org website, which will take you very quickly to the Lawyers and Mediators YouTube channel. And if you find this video amongst the over 100 other videos that are there, you just scroll down and you can see the links for you to click and visit the other websites. I think that deal you've offered, about 40% off your book, is going to be something worthwhile to check out.
It's 740 pages. It makes a great doorstop if you get around to reading it.
So look, I think when you give discounts like that, it takes these things from being just academic to the hands of the masses, and this is what we always want, to spread knowledge.
Well, Mac, that's a very good point, because a lot of the authors and people that we had on CyberWeek are in fact academics, and I guess you could call me a pracademic. I was in the university for quite a while, but I'm not an academic by any stretch of the imagination. But some of the people who were academics were authors. But to a person, instead of writing an academic treatise, what we really aimed for in the conversations during CyberWeek and in the book that sort of we wrapped CyberWeek around was, what does this mean for somebody who's trying to practice using technology? What does it mean in practical terms about how you actually adapt technology into the work that you're doing? And so it's not a series of academic articles. It's a series of sort of reflections on practice by people who have been involved in this for quite some time. And that's a distinction I think that's worth making.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me follow up with you were actually the host of one of the panel discussions, and that panel was on the very beginning, Monday, November the 1st. And in that discussion, there was Ali Khan, Chris Draper, Lauren Thomas Quigley, and Ross Campbell. And so on that topic, it was a panel on transparency, repeatability, and auditability in ODR. Could you speak a little bit about some of the takeaways you had from that specific discussion and what that one was all about?
Yeah, and you have asked me to summarize the hardest one of the whole week to summarize.
I know. Well, that's why I asked you, because I was going through it, and I know, for example, Chris Draper, really smart guy, right? But whenever he talks, he speaks over my head, and so I sometimes need to come to gurus like you to make it simple for the rest of us.
Well, I'm not going to do justice to what they were talking about, I'm sure, but essentially there are two things going on that I think are important in the ODR world. One is a strong move in the direction of the use of blockchain, the use of smart contracts, and the use of AI and algorithms to develop systems that operate semi-independently and at best operate as an adjunct to human third parties, and in my opinion, at worst, take over the role of human third parties. And what they were talking about is how do you organize, how do you design, and how do you deal with those systems in a way that protects the information, but also protects the integrity of the process. I call it, there's artificial intelligence. You can use that term, but I also use the term artificial ignorance. Smart systems can't know what you don't tell them. So where we are with AI now is the systems that we develop in terms of AI are limited by the information that the programmers give those systems to learn from. And so to say that technology is neutral is ridiculous on the face of it, because we are making choices as designers about what we tell that AI to learn from, and we withhold some things and don't tell it to learn from those things. And so we're making choices as we design those systems that invariably cause the systems to operate in a certain way. And as many people have said, it's very easy to create a system that's more biased than an individual, because they're operating only on a very narrow slice of information. And so part of the whole transparency issue is, if I'm going to adopt an algorithm-driven or an AI-driven system that I'm going to use to do access to justice work, or if I'm going to use to do peace building, or if I'm going to use to do mediation, one of the things that I would like is to be able to look behind the curtain, to look inside the black box and say, okay, what is it learning from? What is the data set that it's using to make the rational decisions that it makes? Because you can say that artificial intelligence and machine learning, et cetera, is thoroughly rational. Once you create the environment for it and give it what to learn from, it will make a similar rational decision every time out of the box. The question is that rational decision a decision that is defensible? You can't teach AI empathy, and you can't teach AI to make judgments that are shaded unless you give it the information to make those judgments. And we generally don't do that when we develop AI. So again, I'm not doing justice to Chris's session. You should go and watch it. But that's the crux of it is, how do we guard ourselves against the things that can go wrong when we start giving too much authority to systems that we may not have complete transparency with. And we don't, and replicability is another the terms that's there. One of the ways that you gauge the usefulness, the value, the legitimacy of an online system that operates through AI is, does it issue the same judgment the same way every time it's confronted with a similar situation? Well, the answer to that can be yes, and it can be that they delivered the wrong thing. They delivered a biased thing every time. So we haven't yet caught up in the ODR world with the notion of evaluation of these systems in a way that is guaranteed to guard the privacy, security, and efficacy of those systems. And so that's, generally speaking, that's where that was coming from.
And following on that, I find it in a very interesting contrast with the next session where you were engaged on, which was on ethics, culture, and equity in ODR, and especially with the things that you've been discussing, cultural components of dispute engagement. This is this human factor that, as opposite to the AI, is actually the key component of this entire thing. We are dealing with a real matter of real people, even if we are putting this resolution of this matter onto the electronic environment. We are using online tools. We are using certain methods. All in all, it comes back to us being human and us being able to express those emotions. You have just said that, for example, empathy was one of those critical things, and the other was culture. Since this was something that you've been expanding there, and you already said that you did understand that there will not be one culture sitting at the same table only if there is two people already. Can you tell us some practicalities? What then is vested with the mediator to prepare to these new challenges, to be aware and bring awareness of this cultural diversity whenever we are dealing with a dispute resolution?
Sure, I'll give you sort of my my biased take on this, on what it means. And I see that we're running close on time, so I'll try to do it quickly. Trying to catalog all the differences in culture is a losing proposition, because there are so many nuances in various cultures that, at one time in intercultural communication studies, it was all the rage to say, well, the Polish culture does this, this, and this, and the Haitian culture does this, this, and this. When in fact, my wife and I call it the Colgate Crest caveat. If you give me 300 million people, I'll tell you within a percentage point what toothpaste they'll buy next year. You give me one person out of that group, all bets are off. I had no idea. So to me, and I'll try to make this very quick, the elements of culture that come across most often in third-party work are definitions of what makes people feel safe and secure, what makes people feel that they're being respected, and what makes people feel that there is a structure that makes sense to them, so they're not in a chaotic situation. So if I'm going to be culturally sensitive as a third party, I think the conversation I need to have with my parties revolves around those three things. I'm about to do this. I'm about to run the session this way. Are you okay with that? And what I'm looking for is their notion of, do they feel safe and secure in that environment? Do they feel like they're being respected by the way I'm doing my work and the way the operation's running? And is there a sense from them that they can predict what's going to happen next, that they know where we're going with this? If I can do that, if I can find out how they define those things, and I can adjust my approach to make sure that those needs are met with both sides, then I've created an environment that I invite them into that's going to be workable. It's going to feel comfortable for them, and they're going to react as human beings, not as people who are defending themselves or feel that they have to be on guard all the time. So, I mean, we could talk about this for a long time, but that, to me, it boils down to those really three key things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan. And I think we would want to do another talk with you on those, because there's a universality to this, right? Of safety and predictability and respect. Doesn't matter where you're from. Everybody wants those kind of things whenever you're going to be engaging in a kind of conflict-oriented, operation like mediation or arbitration. All right. With that, we're going to end now, and we'll come back and do another talk a little later. All right. With that, Mac Pierre-Louis signing off.
Natalia Woskachajka, it's been a pleasure then.
Thank you very much, guys. I've enjoyed being with you.
Thank you.